The cold wasn't a temperature. It was a weight, pressing his chest until breathing felt like swallowing shards of ice. Sergeant Elias Vance sat hunched over the firing slit of the concrete bunker, his shift deep in the hour of the wolf, the inevitable 3 a.m. watch. The moon was a sickly sliver, occasionally piercing the low, heavy fog that perpetually clung to the river valley, casting spectral shadows of barbed wire across the muddy earth. Every sound was magnified and yet muffled, an agonizing contradiction that frayed the edges of his sanity. The constant, distant rumble of heavy artillery, muffled by the fog and distance, served less as a threat and more as the world's indifferent heartbeat. His hands, cased in thick wool gloves, trembled slightly, a tremor he knew wasn't entirely due to the biting cold. It was the sound, the incessant, rhythmic sound that was not real, that no one else in the bunker could hear, but which was dominating the silence of the night. Tick, tick, tick dash. Elias knew the field clock had been shattered 3 days ago when Corporal Diaz dropped it during the supply run. Yet the mechanical rhythm persisted, burrowing deep into the folds of his memory and refusing to let go. He pressed the cold butt of his rifle against his cheek, trying to transfer some of the inanimate certainty of the metal into his own collapsing composure. He smelled stale coffee, mildewed canvas, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear that never quite left the air in this godforsaken place. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the darkness instantly filled with the oppressive light of that memory. A memory so small, so irrelevant to the overall conflict, yet one that had become the axis upon which his whole world now spun. The silence of 3 a.m. was where the world paused, where the mission receded, and where the unforgiving demons of the past were finally allowed their full, cruel tenancy. 2 weeks prior, the ticking had been real. They had been sweeping the small, unnamed village, designated Area of Interest 6. It was a place already hollowed out by fear and desertion. They moved slowly, methodically, clearing house after house. The yellow house stood slightly apart from the others, its cheerful paint faded and peeling, looking impossibly misplaced amidst the surrounding ruins. When Elias and Corporal Timms kicked in the flimsy wooden door, they were greeted not by gunfire, but by absolute, oppressive domestic stillness. The air inside smelled faintly of wood smoke and lavender, a cruel ghost scent. They were focused entirely on the operational mandate: weapons, communications equipment, signs of organized resistance. Elias moved through the cramped living space, his boots silent on the dusty, worn rug. He paused by a small, scarred wooden table near the back window. His operational focus was absolute, scanning the corners, checking under the tattered cushions. He registered the clutter: an overturned teacup, a spool of thread, and a stack of papers weighed down by a small antique music box made of dark, polished oak. The music box was the source of the sound. Tick, tick, tick dash, the delicate, winding down mechanism fighting gravity and time. Under the music box was the drawing. It was crude, rendered in cheap, vibrant crayons on the back of a utility bill. A stick figure family with exaggerated smiling faces, standing under a massive, wobbly yellow sun. Elias glanced at it, categorized it mentally as standard civilian collateral, and moved on, his mind already calculating the quickest route to the cellar. Timms had made a low, cynical joke about the domesticity of ruin, and Elias had nodded, agreeing that it was strange how people left their deepest fears and their simplest hopes side by side. He had felt nothing then, just operational fatigue and the urgent need to finish the sweep. It was that lack of feeling, the immediate robotic dismissal of that small, vibrant piece of human history, that now sat lodged like shrapnel in his soul. Now, sitting in the bitter cold of the 3 a.m. watch, Elias forced his breathing into a steady rhythm, trying to push the memory back into the past where it belonged. He mentally recited the patrol route, attempting to tether himself to the present reality of mud, cold steel, and silent vigilance. But the phantom ticking was becoming aggressive, seeming to vibrate in the very bones of the bunker. He could visualize the drawing so clearly now. The thick yellow of the sun, the child's overly large signature scrawled in blue crayon at the bottom, the edges slightly curled. Why hadn't he picked it up? Why hadn't he placed it somewhere safer, or simply carried it out? It was a worthless piece of paper, irrelevant to the fight. Yet his failure to acknowledge its tiny, fierce existence felt like the single greatest moral error of his service. He reasoned that he was tired. He was focused on the mission. The house was likely to be shelled shortly after they left, and the drawing would have been dust either way. But the logic was hollow. The guilt wasn't about saving the paper. It was about the momentary, catastrophic failure of empathy, the instant he prioritized the mechanism of war over the fragility of life. He knew with a dreadful, cold certainty that the family in that drawing, that child, had not survived the subsequent shelling. The scale of his guilt was insane. The burden of 1,000 losses distilled down to one small, brightly colored oversight. We often believe the greatest weight carried by a soldier is the violence inflicted, the lives taken. But sometimes, the deepest scar comes from the humanity they chose to ignore or simply missed in the rush of duty. If you've ever had to make a choice between prioritizing the mission, the cold efficiency of the task, or prioritizing a small, human detail that offered no tactical value but tremendous moral weight, what was the internal calculus that decided your action? Do you think the smallest oversights haunt us the most when the stakes are highest? Share your personal opinion or experience in the comments below. The interrogation of his past failure had peaked, and the defense of his sanity began to crumble entirely. The harsh tick, tick, tick abruptly softened, dissolving into a faint, tinny melody. It was the music box, the saccharine, agonizingly innocent lullaby the box had played as it wound down in the silence of the yellow house. The tune was slow, metallic, and profoundly mournful. Elias squeezed his eyes shut again, a silent, desperate prayer for the sound to stop, but the melody simply wove itself into the cold air, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. He felt the irrational urge to scream at the silent men sleeping in the bunker behind him, to ask them if they heard the sweet, terrible sound of a forgotten child's toy. He slammed the heel of his hand against the frozen concrete wall, trying to ground himself in pain, but the sound only seemed to amplify the lullaby. He focused on the rough texture of the wall, the damp chill trying to enforce the present, yet his vision blurred. He started to see the image of the crude sun and the stick figures overlaid onto the dark, damp wood paneling of the bunker interior. They weren't smiling anymore. Their crayon faces were twisted into silent, accusing O's. He knew, intellectually, that the scent of this bunker was oil and sweat, but suddenly, the air was thick with the faint, unmistakable smell of cheap crayon wax and dusty wood polish, the exact scent of the room he had abandoned 2 weeks ago. He began to whisper, hoarse and low, "I'm sorry. I should have taken it. I should have seen it." He wasn't apologizing for the war, or the shelling, or the loss of life. He was apologizing to the drawing, to the mere physical representation of a life he had failed to register. His rifle, a heavy, precise tool of duty, felt impossibly light and alien in his hands, completely useless against the enemy that had successfully breached the perimeter of his mind. The sky began to pale, the first streaks of bruised purple bleeding into the horizon, signaling the end of the 3 a.m. watch. Sergeant Timms arrived for the changeover, stomping the mud off his boots as he entered the shelter. Timms immediately noticed the rigid posture, the sweat freezing on Elias's temples despite the cold, and the horrifying, unfocused stare fixed on the muddy ground beyond the slit. "Vance, you all right? Look like you saw a ghost," Timms muttered, his voice thick with sleep. Elias didn't respond, only clutching the rifle tighter, his knuckles white. The whispered apologies had ceased, replaced by a low, desperate humming, the echo of the music box melody. Timms cautiously reached out, placing a gloved hand on Elias's shoulder, feeling the shiver that ran deep through his frame. "Hand over the piece, Sergeant. Watch is over." Elias finally surrendered the rifle, his fingers slow and stiff, his gaze distant. As Timms took the weapon, Elias turned his head slowly, whispering, not to Timms, but past him into the heavy morning air, "The clock, the terrible clock is broken. Timms didn't need an explanation. He saw the devastation not of battle fatigue, but of intimate, surgical sorrow. He gently guided Elias away from the post, back into the dim center of the bunker, realizing that the overwhelming mechanism of war had been momentarily defeated, and one man was destroyed not by high-explosive shrapnel, but by the memory of a piece of paper left behind. Elias was escorted back to the rear, leaving the watch post silent once more, the faint internal tick, tick, tick finally starting to fade, but leaving behind the cold, empty chasm of a shattered man. The great, indifferent war machine continued its grind, oblivious to the small, haunting details that break a soldier far more effectively than any bullet. If the unseen battles of the human spirit resonate with you, if you find solace in stories that explore the quiet edges of existence and the psychological cost of conflict, please subscribe to Quiet Soldier Stories. Thank you for listening.